Tonight we will be covering a range of different topics, from a short story involving the number neighbor trend, to stories of killer plants, insects, and a lot more. Each story will have its own horrors to share. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to narrate their stories. As always, you can find their links in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy these hour-long videos, please be sure to drop a like rating, as it lets me know that you want more of them. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Everyone knows about that stupid trend on Twitter, texting your number neighbor. The phone number went away from yours. Many of my real-life friends and online friends were doing the challenge, some getting funny results and some making new friends, and some just not getting answered at all. So I thought, what's the harm in trying? I sat on my couch and punched in the number that was one higher than mine, and sent a message. Me. Hey number neighbor, what's up? Then I sat back and waited for a reply. It was hours before I received anything back, and I wasn't too disappointed. I wasn't expecting anything anyway. Then, at exactly midnight, my phone went off. Unknown. Hey number neighbor, I can see you. I sat up in my bed and read it again. I can see you. What? My phone went off again. Unknown. Why are you ignoring me, number neighbor? I didn't reply. Unknown. Do you not want to talk now? I can see you're scared. Unknown. I'm outside your window. My eyes widened as I read the last message. It couldn't be true, right? It was probably just to scare me. Either way, I was checking my window. I had my phone in hand with 911 on speed dial in case something happened. I turned on my flashlight and cast it around the darkness outside the window, finding nothing. As I expected, it was just a joke. My phone went off again. Unknown. Wrong window. Smiley face. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest as I went to check the other windows. Nothing. I decided to block the number to spare myself a lot of much unneeded anxiety, as I could see that my number neighbor most likely wasn't going to be a friend. I fell asleep a while after that, only to be awakened by thunder. It was raining. I looked out my window and listened to the soft pitter-patter of the rain as I tried to fall back asleep. Then I saw something. It was in a split second when lightning flashed. A figure in my window. A humanoid figure, with long arms and legs, and smooth white skin. They had holes for eyes, and were smiling. Right next to them was a message written in window fog. I guess you didn't want to play, huh? Then it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I moved to the living room and watched TV to distract myself from what I had just seen. It had to be a misconception. Only it wasn't. For the rest of the night I sat in the living room, paranoid out of my mind, flinching at every sound. I dozed off briefly, only to be awakened again by scratching at my door. I did the smart thing and I didn't check it out. It was probably just a tree. I checked back in my room the next morning, and the message was still there. I guess you didn't want to play, huh? I can still hear sounds in my house at night, like someone is crawling around. I don't know if I should call the police or not. I don't know if they'll believe me. Have you ever been out in the middle of a wheat field at night? They can be several square miles, so even though it only grows about 2 feet tall in America, there's still nothing but wheat for as far as the eye can see. You'd think that such an open space might leave you feeling free, but it doesn't. It makes you feel very, very exposed. During college, I worked summers for a small agricultural pest control business in Oklahoma. My boss, Owen, only had 1 truck and 2 employees. Will, a local 20-something with a punk band, and myself. We would start at sunrise and spend all day spraying hundreds of acres. Owen would drive the truck along slowly, tracking our progress with a GPS, while Will and I would apply the pesticide with hoses from the truck's humongous tank. There are much better ways to apply pesticide, like a plane or a rig, but farmers are notoriously cheap, and Owen was cheaper. We were also in one of the worst droughts in the history of Oklahoma, and agriculturalists everywhere were tightening their belts. So I took what work I could get. One August evening, we were out spraying for an old friend of Owen's. It was a large wheat field, a few square miles at least, and the sun was disappearing below the horizon. In a few minutes, it would start getting harder to see, and Owen would have to turn on the truck's mounted floodlights. About how much more? Asked Will when Owen stopped the truck for a water break. We'd have been done a long while ago if the tank weren't giving us issues, replied Owen, checking the GPS. We probably got another hour or so. Sometimes you gotta spray after dark. So we kept spraying. It was about 15 minutes later. Owen hadn't even turned on the floodlights when Will started yelling over the roar of the tank to me. When he got my attention, he started pointing forward. What's wrong with the field? He yelled. I squinted. About 50 yards ahead. The field did indeed look different, but it was too difficult to tell exactly how in the dimming light. Will rapped on the truck's window. The truck stopped, and Will shouted over the tank. After a moment, Owen turned on the floodlights, and we all gasped. 50 yards out, the field was devastated. Empty stalks were strewn everywhere. Not a single plant left standing. I'd only ever seen this sort of thing on the news or in books. Owen stopped the car, and we all jogged ahead to inspect. Harvey didn't mention any empty patches in his field, said Owen when we arrived, kneeling down to inspect the ground. He probably doesn't know about it yet. Called us too late, too. See this stalk? Looks fresh, and it looks like insect activity. Owen pulled out his phone and tried calling his friend, but nobody answered. Do we spray it? Asked Will. Seems a waste of application. He hired us for the whole field. Owen shrugged. I groaned internally. I'd rather be on my way home. But I couldn't begrudge Owen. He was cheap, but he was a good man. I turned to get back to work, but my legs froze in place when my eyes caught the outline of a dark shape on the empty ground. What's that? I said. The others turned, and we all gathered around the dimly lit form. It was a dog. Brown, medium size, and dead. I gave its leg a nudge, which flopped lifelessly, so rigor mortis hadn't set in. I couldn't tell the dog's breed, though for a moment, I wondered if it was part pug. Looks young, healthy even, said Owen, and fresh. The flies haven't even set in yet. Wait, said Will. It's moving. The dog's cheek was gently wriggling. I almost thought the dead animal's face was still convulsing when a large, brown grasshopper crawled slowly out of the dog's mouth. It was wet, and a few strands of some dark, unidentifiable fluid dangled from its long back legs. Huh? Was all I could say. But grasshoppers don't eat dead meat, said Will. Some will, said Owen. But only when they're real desperate, not when there's plenty of wheats to chow down on. Matter of fact, I'm guessing this guy and his friends are what did the crops in. Then where are his friends? I asked. For a moment, we all stood in silence. Lots of time, especially in summer evenings as the sun sets. You can hear the chirping of grasshoppers, and even the buzz of faraway cicadas. But as we stopped in this field, while the sun continued below the horizon, our ears were met only with a stony silence. The newly discovered grasshopper continued crawling its way along the ground. It was weird to see a grasshopper crawl instead of hop. It felt unnatural. I'll squish him, said Will. Leave him, said Owen. The spray will choke him soon enough. Let's get back to work. So we returned to spraying. It became much easier once we reached the devastated crops, since all we could really do was spray the ground. We'd only been spraying for another 10 minutes when, much to the surprise of Will and me, Owen shut off the tank. The stream of chemicals from our hoses weakened and died, and Will and I looked at each other in surprise. What's up? We asked as Owen got out of the truck. Owen didn't say anything. With a concerned look, he walked around to the front of the truck, looked to the horizon, and started staring. He was squinting westward, to where the sun had finally disappeared, leaving only remnants of the sunset. What's up? I asked. There's somebody out here with us, said Owen. We squinted into the dying light. I could barely make it out against the western horizon, but after a few moments, I recognized the silhouette of a figure, a good 100 yards away, ambling slowly towards us. Then quickly, slowly, quickly. Owen was right. There was someone out in the field with us. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Who would be out here alone? It wasn't Harvey, the field owner. He was a round man, and the figure in the distance seemed almost gangly, and it appeared to be struggling. It seemed to move its whole body just to take a single, laborious step. He's moving weird, said Owen as he squinted. It almost looks like he's having a hard time breathing. And Owen took off sprinting to help the figure. After several seconds, I looked at Will. He shrugged, I shrugged, and we both started off in a slow jog after Owen, who had managed to get a good 20 yards ahead of us. It was late enough to see that we were getting closer to the figure, but dark enough that we couldn't actually see what it looked like. "Is that a cloud?" asked Will, panting as we jogged. It took a second, but I saw what he was talking about. A dark, floating mass had appeared out of nowhere, and it was heading straight for us. There was a dull buzz, and I only realized what it was a few moments before it engulfed us. It was a humongous swarm of locusts. The insects zoomed toward us, whizzing past our faces noisily. As the swarm surrounded us, the noise grew louder and more horrible, like 100 lawnmowers all going at once. I could no longer make out Owen ahead of us, much less the figure. The insects became so dense they started flying into us, their bodies colliding against our faces and chests. I closed my eyes as we kept running, but it got so bad that, after a minute, Will and I were forced to stop. "Did you see where Owen went?" Will yelled over the roar of the swarm, and I yelled back that I had not. For about 10 minutes, all we could do was stand there. I'd never seen so many insects all in one place before. The last bit of sunlight died, leaving us in the dark of night. Finally, the swarm seemed to thin out. We could start moving forward without the bugs hitting our faces. We jogged in the darkness for a bit, calling out Owen's name. I was right in the middle of a particularly loud and long "Owen" when, without realizing it, I face planted into the dirt. I got the wind completely knocked out of me. For a moment, I could only lay there. Finally, my brain registered that I had tripped over something. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. Why hadn't I thought of this before? And illuminated the light to see what I had tripped over. It was Owen, and he was stone dead. I gasped as I scrambled away. Owen's body was sprawled out on its back, and it was covered in locusts. And how did I know Owen was dead? An entire mass of locusts were crawling around the inside of his open mouth, packed so densely that I couldn't see his teeth or tongue. There was no way he was alive, and to seemingly confirm this thought, I watched as a particularly large locust crawled over his glassy, open eye, and just stayed there. I gaped at the spectacle in the light of my cell phone as Will ran up. His reaction was a bit more visceral, lots more vomiting and swearing. I turned off the light of my already almost dead cell phone, and my eyes eventually adjusted to the dark. The buzz of locusts continued as they whizzed past our heads. "We should call an ambulance," I offered. "He's already dead," said Will. "What good's an ambulance gonna do?" "It's what you're supposed to do in this situation," I insisted, not actually knowing what to do in this situation. "Let's call from the truck. We should get out of here before the grasshoppers get us too," said Will, swatting uselessly at the swarm. "I don't think locusts can kill a man," I said. "Not by themselves." "Then what did kill Owen then, Charlie?" said Will defiantly. "Maybe Owen just had a heart attack. We can..." But I was interrupted by a sound only a few yards behind Will. We both turned, and because my eyes had adjusted to the darkness, I was able to see the outline of a hobbling figure shuffling its way toward us. Will and I turned and ran for our damn lives. Of course this meant running through the swarm. That was the direction of the truck, and the truck was our best chance of escaping whatever had befallen Owen. We could barely see where we were going, but it was better than what was behind us. "What was that thing?" Will screamed as we ran. My lungs were starting to give out on me. I couldn't have answered if I'd wanted to. Still, I sprinted. I stole a glance backward, though the swarm was too thick to see anything in the dying light. But it was still coming after us. I just knew it. It had gotten Owen, and it wouldn't stop until it got us too. After a few minutes, however, we had a stroke of luck. I cheered internally as fluorescent lights slowly became visible through the swarm. It was the truck's floodlights, guiding our way back. Onward we sprinted, locusts grazing our faces. We finally arrived at the truck. Fortunately, it was still running. Owen had only turned off the tank. We immediately scrambled in, me in the passenger seat and Will in the driver's, and I was slowed down by the bottles of pesticide on the seat, which I frantically threw to the floor. We slammed our door shut. Will threw the gear into drive, and we peeled the hell out of there. The headlights illuminated the hundreds of brown locusts that flew in front of us as we drove. The truck wasn't going fast enough to splatter them yet, so they bounced noisily against the windshield like large hail. Soon a sizable collection of wings and legs started sticking to the glass. Will even turned on the windshield wipers, but try as we might, we couldn't see farther than 3 feet out the windshield as we drove. So we shouldn't have been surprised when Will drove the truck into a drainage ditch. I had put on my seatbelt. Will hadn't. His head slammed against the steering wheel. For a few moments, he seemed stunned. but he came to after a few seconds. Will slammed his foot on the gas. We could hear the tires spinning uselessly. We were at such an incline that I doubted the back tires were even touching the ground. Will swore and slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration. Bang, came the metallic sound of something striking one of the truck's rear doors. Our eyes widened as we looked at each other, and then turned to look back. 2 more bangs. The door shook violently. "It's outside," whispered Will. "It's trying to get in." Could it be? We'd driven away. Was the thing that fast? But what else could it be? I considered the direction we had come from, the direction that the car had been pointing, and my stomach sank as I realized that Will had not driven us away from the thing. He had driven us right towards it. Suddenly Will screamed, yanking his hands from the steering wheel. It was now crawling with locusts. I looked down. The locusts were crawling up from the floor. They'd gotten in through the underside of the truck. They even started squeezing out of the AC vents. Within a few seconds, it seemed the cab was flooded with them. We began frantically brushing them off as they flew around, and I saw the panic rising in Will's eyes. "They can't kill you," I insisted as I swatted the insects away. "They killed Owen. They're going to eat us," shouted Will, and he reached for the door handle. "That thing's out there," I screamed. "I'm running for it." He screamed back as he opened the door. He leaped out and disappeared out of view, leaving the car door open and me exposed to whatever was out there. Before I could say anything, the swarm outside flooded into the cab. I closed my eyes as they brushed against my face. I could feel them crawling on my arms and legs. The door was still open, and all I could think about was if the thing outside was going to crawl in and kill me. There was a heavy slam against the hood of the truck. My eyes instinctively jolted open. It was Will. His body was blocking the headlight, so I couldn't see much of him except for his panicking face, which was crawling with locusts. No, there was something more. There was something around his throat. No, they were thin, almost skeletal hands. Something was holding him against the hood. His face grew ruddier as he clawed at the emaciated fingers of his assailant. I was frozen in place and could only watch as his bulging eyes rolled back into his head. Finally, Will's body relaxed and slumped over, his eyes unfocused. If I had to guess, I'd say his windpipe and spine had both been crushed. The locust seemed to take no notice of this, and continued to crawl around his face. I didn't even have a chance to hop into the driver's seat when the thing appeared through the open door, and it looked right at me. If it was once human, I couldn't tell. Its flesh looked like that of the naked mummies they sometimes pull out of desert sands. The skin stretched and hardened. Where there should have been eyes were only sockets, from which a few locusts would randomly emerge. Where there should have been a nose was only a cavity, where I could see various antennae, and the occasional leg sticking out. But this was not the worst. The thing's ribcage was exposed, and I could see into it, and it appeared to be completely filled with humongous locusts. Even over the din of the swarm, I could hear the dull buzz of the crowded insects as they writhed around in their bony cage. Occasionally, a smaller locust would manage to squeeze its way between 2 ribs. It would crawl around the exposed ribs for a few moments before leaping off and joining the swarm. The thing cocked its head. How it sensed me without eyes, I don't know. The thing moaned, and its jaw began to creak open. I could hear the straining and cracking of leathery tissues, revealing a mouth with uneven, rotting yellow teeth. Suddenly the thing vomited. A thick stream of brown liquid shot out and sprayed me, getting my shirt and my bare arm. Before, the locusts had been swarming in a natural, random manner, but at the sound of the vomiting, the insects immediately focused their attention on the liquid. I was now covered in the insects. Their buzzing was deafening, and the stench of the liquid was almost overpowering. It smelled like liquid smoke and bile. Dozens of locusts flew out of the thing's mouth, and joined the other ones now crawling all over me. I could feel the locust's tiny mandibles against the skin of my arm, scraping away at the substance. It didn't hurt, but damned if it didn't freak me the hell out. I screamed. As I sat there, Owen's body flashed through my mind. I realized something. The locusts hadn't been crawling around his mouth. They had been crawling out of it. With a sudden sickness, I understood that the grasshoppers hadn't killed Owen directly. They didn't have poison or venom, or even a way of really biting him. No, the thing had grabbed Owen and forced dozens of locusts from its mouth down into Owen's throat. Owen had slowly choked to death as the crammed insects crawled and fluttered in his esophagus, trapped in the narrow space by their own sheer numbers. I almost gave up hope right there. The thing was now slowly clawing its way through the cab toward me, its dead-looking hand reaching blindly out toward me. I tried groping behind me to open the door. I didn't dare take my eyes off of the thing, lest it jump at me when I wasn't looking. I was almost completely covered in locusts too, all except for my right leg. Wait, why weren't the locusts swarming me there? For the slightest moment, I glanced downward. One of the pesticide bottles was puddling onto the floor of the truck. I had knocked it open when I had thrown it to the ground. When diluted with water, 5 ounces to about 50 gallons, most insects wouldn't notice the pesticide, but in its concentrated form, they knew full well that it was something to avoid. The thing crawled closer to me still. I had to take a gamble. Well, it clearly knew I was here. The way it felt around and the fact that it had no eyes told me that it might not actually be able to see me. I might be safe to make a sudden movement. I reached down, grabbed the bottle of pesticide, and flung its contents at the thing. Some flew out. The cap wasn't open all the way, but the thing screeched horribly and reeled back. But it was only for a moment. The thing didn't flee. I opened the bottle more and began flinging as much pesticide onto it as I could. The thing continued screeching. I wanted to grab another bottle, but the now frenzied locusts were too numerous and were weighing me down. In desperation, I began drizzling the pesticide on myself. Not normally a good idea. The locusts began to disperse. Another bottle, opened it completely, and began throwing as much poison onto the thing as I could. Finally, the thing began to retreat out the door. I was able to open the truck door and stumble out. I ran like I'd never run before. The din of the swarm's buzzing began to fade behind me. Ahead of me only miles and miles of lonely wheat fields. Once or twice I thought I heard shuffling footsteps behind me, but I only ever saw stalks of wheat swaying slowly in the night breeze. I eventually made it to a dirt road. My phone couldn't get a signal, so I walked the dirt road for 2 hours until I finally hit a paved road, where, 3 hours later, I was able to flag down a trucker who let me use his phone to call a ride before I contacted the police. The police never got back to me. They didn't even call me in for questioning. Owen and Will's bodies were never found, and their families never got any closure either. At least none that I heard of. I got acute poisoning from the pesticide, which resulted in several patches of dead skin that have since scarred over. I later learned that Harvey and his family, the owners of the fields, were reported missing. After their disappearance, the land became the property of the government, and from what I've been able to find, is now considered mostly useless. They just can't get anything to grow there. I spent many a Friday night of my late teens wandering. Oftentimes I was with a group of friends, trying to stretch our plans as far as they could go. Sometimes we'd end up at a friend's house. Sometimes we stayed at the church until they made us leave. Sometimes we strolled aimlessly through the park or ended up in a different side of town. These late Friday nights probably contributed to my love of horror, supernatural, and the thrill of the unknown. Sleep deprivation with teenage rebellion likely contributes to a slew of things, but in my opinion, you can't love horror without a bit of imagination. One Friday night, a group of semi-faceless friends and I were wandering the park, talking about nothing. The most confident shared their stories, while the less confident added their own quips and comments, and the rest laughed or listened to the meaningless chatter. We were sitting on a series of rocks and moss, encircling each other and each vying for the attention of the party, when one older boy with budding facial hair spoke up. "Guys, I've got a scary story." There was something about the seriousness of his tone that felt like catnip to our ears. The chattering hushed and we all leaned forward in a rare moment of confused attention. The boy squared his shoulders and gravely accepted his new position as bard and storyteller. He took a deep breath. "My older brother told me this story after he came back from his mission," he started. "We were all part of a youth group from a big city. Street savvy, rebellious kids, but children of God on Sundays. He was serving in, I forget the name, Japan. He and his mission companion were assigned an area in a part of the city they had not been to before, in a new apartment. In fact, it was a new area for the mission, and the apartment had just been set up for the first set of missionaries to live. As he and his companion were taking their backpacks up the stairs to move into their new apartment, they crossed paths with an elder woman who was making her way across the ground floor. As she passed the stairs, she stopped to shake her head at the ascending steps. My brother looked at the woman, looked at the stairs, and then back at the woman. In his imperfect Japanese, he asked her why she was shaking her head. She looked back at him and said what he thought she said. was that the stairs were bad luck, and then went about her business. They didn't notice it right away, but the steps to the second floor apartments had an odd number, 13 steps. At least one of us shivered at this spooky detail. The boy continued talking. That night my brother and his missionary companion had finished moving in. When they went to bed, everything seemed fine. It was just another stint in a different area. But then my brother was woken up too early that morning, about 2 or 3 a.m., by some kind of noise. His companion was still asleep, so he went to look for the source of the noise by himself. It sounded like a group of children laughing and playing. Why would kids be out and about this late? He thought. The laughter seemed to be coming from outside the building, so he walked to the window to check it out. But when he opened it, the voices stopped. When he looked down onto the street, no one was there. Already we were hooked. Our eyes relaxed from their straining to see in the dark, and we let our imaginations color the scene in our mind's eye. It was a bit cold that night, so he shut the window quickly and turned to go back to his room. But when he walked past the front door to his room, he heard something else. A thump. What was it? One of the younger kids asked in a voice sounding simultaneously sarcastic and excited. Quickly, one of the others shushed her in response. He didn't know. The storyteller replied simply. But somehow it was a kind of thump that stops you in your tracks. The kind that sends a shiver down your spine, like the feeling that you are being watched when you're alone. Whatever it was, my brother couldn't completely get back to sleep that night. The next morning he couldn't quite be sure if he had dreamt any of it, or if he was just startled by the sounds of a new building. He thought it was whatever, and didn't mention it to his companion. The day goes by normally, and by night, they're both ready to have a good night's sleep. This time my brother was out for the whole night, but he says that he dreamt of the thump again, twice. Later they run into the landlord, who checks in on them. The apartment is good, the utilities work fine. They're adjusting to the new space. Then the landlord tells them that he hopes it works out, since it's been a while since anyone has been able to stay inside that apartment for more than 2 weeks. My brother was like, wait, what? Or he could have misheard the landlord. His companion was also confused, so they look at each other, and then his companion asked why, but their landlord just shrugged and said with a laugh, just a bit of superstition. Now the two are like, okay, that's weird, but whatever, because they have a job to do. The day goes normally. They return back to the apartment in the evening for food and eventually get ready for bed. But this time my brother wakes up again really early in the morning, and he hears the children playing again. He quickly gets out of bed and goes to the window, but when he opens it, there is no one outside. He can't hear any voices. He can't see any kids outside. This time he knows he's not dreaming, so he shuts the window and then stands in the middle of the room. He waits for a little, but then he hears the thump again, followed by 2 more thumps. I would say I remember a chill going down my spine, but I can't remember anything else except how I envisioned the story in my mind. I can see the moonlight shining through the window, but it's not enough to illuminate the entire space. The majority of the apartment remains dimly lit to deeply dark. As if he suspected our rising questions, he continued. The thumps were coming from somewhere outside the apartment. My brother went to the door and listened, but he didn't hear anything. Then he looked through the peephole, and also didn't hear anything. Then he takes a deep breath and slowly unlocks the door. He leans out and looks up and down the stairs. Again, nothing. So he shuts the door and locks it. This time, he decides to tell his companion in the morning. When he explains it to his companion, the response is a bit skeptical. My brother was always really inquisitive growing up, so he says to his companion that they should figure out what was going on. He suggested that tonight the two stay up that night to confirm the laughter and thumps. It took some convincing, but eventually they both agree on a plan. Now it's the 4th night in the new apartment. My brother's companion has drifted off to sleep a couple times, but eventually 2:30 a.m. rolls by. So my brother wakes him up to listen for anything suspicious, and at 2:38, they both hear laughter coming from outside. They look at each other, and my brother has this "I told you" smile on his face, and they both go to the window to investigate. This time his companion opens the window, and the sounds stop. Neither of them hear or see anything. Now his companion rolls his eyes, and is about to tell my brother that he kept him up for nothing. But then they both hear it. A thump, then another one, and another one, and then another one. At this, his companion is pretty spooked, and they stay up for a while waiting for anything else. Eventually they go back to sleep and wake up the next morning to talk about it. Now my brother proposes an experiment. They see how long they can stay in the apartment. Most people left after 2 weeks, so all they had to do was hold down for another 10 days. My brother is like, heck yeah, we got this. It's easy. While his companion is a little wigged out. Now for the next few nights they take turns staying up. Sometimes they fall asleep, only to be waken up by the familiar sound of children's laughter. Of course, there is never anyone outside the window, and the thumping starts at 2:38 in the morning, sometimes 2:39, and there is always one more thump than the night before. They make it through a whole week before my brother's missionary companion says something. He says to my brother one day that he thinks the thumping is coming from outside the front door, in the stairwell. My brother can see that his companion is becoming genuinely afraid. I think something is climbing up the stairs. So they go to talk to their mission president, who agrees to pay the place a visit with them. Together, they all say a prayer in the apartment, asking for peace and safety and things like that. My brother and his companion are both relieved, and the mission president leaves. That night they go to bed and sleep deeply, feeling much better. They wake up the next day and don't really think about the thumps and the strange laughter, and the day goes on. But then the next night my brother wakes up at the same time and hears the children again. But this time he goes straight to the door and opens it. And he just stands there, waiting. But this time he doesn't hear the footsteps, and he doesn't see anything in the stairwell. After about 15 minutes, he gives up and closes the door. But after locking it, he hears it again. Thump, thump, thump. And he goes up to the door to listen. The thumps are getting louder, but only slightly. They almost sound like footsteps. I knew it. Someone in the circle whispered loudly. The remark was met with some giggles and hushes. The story continued on. About this time they have been staying in the apartment for 12 days and nights. When the evening of the 13th night rolls around, the companion says to my brother that he's still on edge, that he can still hear the thumping at night. My brother says to him like, if we stay for 2 more nights, we'll have made it for 2 weeks. And his companion is like, why? And my brother just goes, well, I want to see what happens. A couple of listeners who are most engaged in the story start quietly saying, nope, nope, nopity nope, as if they could reach back in time to talk sense into the 2 missionaries. The 13th night comes around, and my brother sets an alarm for 2:15 in the morning. When the alarm goes off, he shakes awake his companion, and together they both go sit in the living room. At 2:38, right on schedule, they hear the children laughing outside, but neither of them move. After a few minutes the laughter stops, and the thumping starts. Thump, thump, thump. With each sound, they count the steps in their heads. Thump, thump, 6, 7, 8. And they hear the thumps getting slightly louder, closer. 9, 10, 11. The companion starts to freak out, but my brother grabs his shoulder to make him stay. The last few steps seem to be the loudest and the heaviest. They listen for the 13th thump and hold their breath, but hear nothing. They sit in silence, waiting for something, but nothing happens. They look at each other in relief and then go back to bed. The next morning they are both like, we made it 13 nights and we're still here. That kind of thing. But he was a bit disappointed that nothing happened. Now they feel like they can really focus on the work they're doing without any more distractions. There was a pause, and I realized I was absent-mindedly biting my nails, a habit I thought I had grown out of after middle school. I gripped my hands in my lap and leaned forward into the seemingly endless pause, but they still had to make it one more night. The whole day they both felt weird and nervous, but they were so close, and my brother really wanted to see it through, so they decided to stay up that night until they heard the sounds. My brother and his companion didn't fall asleep accidentally either. They were both too wired. My brother's alarm went off at 2:30, so he had to leave the living room to stop it, but when he returned to the living room, he saw his companion sitting on the floor, freaking out. They heard the children laughing outside the window, but for some reason, it seemed different somehow. And when the thumps came, each thump was louder and closer than the one before it. Silently he counted the thumps, and watched his companion grow more and more frightened with each thump. By the 10th thump, he was visibly shaking and totally focused on the door. Thump 11. It was sounding really close now. Thump 12. Even closer to the second floor. Thump 13. And a slight creak. For a moment neither of them heard anything, but then my brother swears he started to hear some shuffling and creaking. But then his companion jumps up and screams, "No!" throws open the door, and bolts out of the apartment. My brother only takes a second to react, but on instinct, he runs after his companion and out of the apartment. Somehow they call their mission president and find a different place to stay that night, but after that, they were both like, "We're not staying there again." So the next morning my brother, his companion, and the mission president go back to the apartment to do some cleaning and get their things. Then after that they get moved to a different apartment, never speak about it again. My brother waited until he got home after his mission to tell me this story. I don't think even my parents know, but he told me about the last night, and the horrible, scary feeling he got right before his companion threw open the door. Then with a grin that shone amidst the darkness, he finished. He said it felt like something was about to come into the room. After this, I don't remember much about the rest of the night, or how I got home. We probably speculated over the story and quickly changed the subject to something less spooky. But I know that when I got home, I was very glad that my apartment had an elevator. That house smells like death. I told my friend about the place I passed on the walk to her house. The stench was getting worse. She said that an old person probably died there, and had no one to check on them. We decided to check it out together, so we traveled a couple blocks until we reached the lilac painted home. The yard was littered with weeds. No car stood in the driveway. We noticed a sign in the corner of the window, black paper with red lettering. It read, "Dog, keep out." Once over the fence, we wandered in the backyard, pushed our way through overgrown bushes, and noted that all the windows were locked and had closed blinds. There was a sliding glass door at the back of the house, where we stopped to peek inside. Something moved and ran at the door. It was a messy and matted Bichon, which then bounced in front of the glass and attempted to bark at us. We could barely hear a weak, hoarse sound emitting from its throat. Beyond the dog, I noticed a purple cup rested on the floor ahead of the dining room table. The contents of the cup had spilled over the floor and attracted the attention of an ant colony. I tried to open the glass door. It wouldn't budge. My friend grabbed my hand. She was breathing erratically and she said, "Let's get out of here. We'll call the cops or something." "Why? Are you scared?" I asked her. I noticed she was squeezing her wrist as she spoke. "No, I'm tired." "You can go," I said. "But don't call anyone yet. I'll do it after I finish looking around here." I watched her push through the bushes and disappear from sight. I decided to try all the doors. Of each, it was oddly the front one that I found unlocked. I walked in and was forced to cover my nose with my shirt. The stench was too much. The first sight was a family portrait stuck to the wall. A bald, grumpy man. A glamorous, sad woman. A bald, frustrated baby. I continued to walk through the house with a tiny dog wheezing and biting at my feet. I found a can of unopened dog food in the kitchen, opened it, set it on a plate, and left it on the floor. In the process, I'd let my shirt off my nose. I breathed shallowly as I stepped onward. Every door inside of the house was shut. In the first bedroom, the furniture was missing. The carpet was missing too. It appeared that someone tried to patch up the floor with plaster, among other materials. Everything was cracking. In the second bedroom, everything was normal, apart from a plant that grew through the carpet. I walked over and tugged on its stem. It was a green, tough sort of weed with sparse leaves and a thick stalk. The dog followed me again but refused to enter that room. I couldn't open the door to the next room no matter how hard I tried. The next door was the same. I kicked at it in frustration. Then I punched it and punched it again. The door was thin and hollow, so I soon created a hole. I smashed my hand through and hit something hard beyond the door. The smell was stronger. I pulled my hand away and paused in front of the door, stuck in my thoughts. I could smell it from the street. How am I the first to discover this? This is ridiculous. I then heard a sound, a groan. It came from down the hall, beyond a door I had skipped. I jogged over and tried to open it. It wouldn't budge until I shoved into it with my shoulder. When it opened, I feared for my lungs, and for my insides, when the smell of that bathroom hit me. I gagged. I saw a thing writhing around in the tub. Dark green bony arms, and ripped, shredded skin. And I saw blood. So much blood. Both dried and fresh. Movement, frantic. Chunks of skin, intertwined with leaves and green, pumping veins and fluid. Fluid all over. Splashing droplets, moist air. There was a face, but there were no eyes. There were veins where there should have been eyes, then veins sprouting from the nostrils, veins traveling into the mouth, and stems jutting out from the throat. There was a hideous mixture of plant and skin, covering everything. Yet I could tell. It was her. It was the glamorous, sad woman groaning, writhing, reaching for me. Are you... I stepped closer to her. Oh God. I slipped as I tried to step again. I landed on the cracked tiles, but then soaked in a puddle of muddy water. In gelatinous globs. I witnessed more muddy water splash from the tub as she twisted, writhed, and groaned. Her arms reached for my legs. I tried to move them out of the way. I tried to move away on the wet and sticky linoleum floor, but in the process, I slipped again and we made contact. She clawed at me and broke the skin on my right calf. My legs bled, and felt as if they were burning. I shouted, kicked out with my other leg, and managed to crawl away, coating my knees and arms with more of the wetness and mud. When I thought I was safe, I stood up at the bathroom's entrance, looked back, and I noticed. One of those tough-stemmed plants was in the tub with her, half hidden behind the partially torn down shower curtain. I then noticed a note on the bathroom counter. I could see enough to tell it was a suicide note, but I didn't look for long. I hurried out and picked up the dog, who I found cowering at the end of the hallway. She tried to wriggle out of my arms and to bite at me, but I persisted. I ran. I tore out of that house. My right leg throbbed, and I looked down to see if I was leaving behind a trail of red. As I rushed down the block, I became lightheaded, and everything seemed so much faster. Louder. I persisted. As I went, I grabbed for my cell phone but discovered it wasn't in my jacket. I finally got to my friend's house and banged on her door. When I got inside with the door closed behind, I let the dog out of my arms. The dog ran to hide in a corner behind a table. My friend saw my leg. What the hell? Call 911, I told her. Call now. As she dialed, I got down on the ground and tried to apply pressure to my leg. The bleeding lessened somewhat, but I wasn't relieved, because soon after, there came slight but repeated twitches in my calf muscles. My friend told them I was bleeding and began to give her address. I motioned to her to hand me the phone. I said, the lilac, purple, whatever the fuck color, house on 15th Street. A woman's in there and I don't know what the fuck happened to her. I was told to slow down and then pressed for other details. You won't believe me if I tell you exactly what I saw, I said. But she's half plant. But she's alive. I don't know. My friend grabbed the phone from me. I'm sorry, she said. Are you sending someone over here? I'm not crazy, I yelled at her. You smelled it. You were there earlier. Tell them. It smells wrong over there. Why don't they get over there? The twitching in my leg was stronger. My friend noticed. There's something wrong. She described the twitching to the operator. My whole leg jerked upwards on its own, and the twitching increased with more force. I raised my hands for my leg and inspected the cuts, which then had a green hue, and if I squinted, I could see miniature vines poking through the raw parts of my skin. Cut it off, I yelled. You have to cut it off. I told my friend. No, she said. You have to calm down. It's okay. They'll be here any minute. My leg twitched violently. I was coated in sweat. Nausea increased. I got on my knees and crawled. My friend tried to stop me and hug me, but I pushed her away and dragged myself to the kitchen. I scrambled to grab the sharpest knives. She tried to stop me again, but I threatened her with a knife and ordered her to back off. I took the sharpest one and held my breath as I tried to hack it into the skin beneath my knee. At first, I could barely get the knife as deep as I wanted, but I continued to desperately stab away, bit by bit, as the blood rushed out. I kept cutting as much as I could. Reflecting on that moment, I don't remember the pain so well. It's a blur, but I distinctly remember when I hit the bone and couldn't get through. In frustration, I took the knife to the bottom of my leg and attempted to slice upwards. I couldn't get it off me. I couldn't get my calf off. I went through all the motions, clenched my teeth hard, and kept going at myself with that knife. Then I screamed, grunted, and tried to force everything I was feeling out through my throat. I was seeing dots and, I swear, those vines were poking through hard. Those vines were growing quick. I began to vomit and it was green. I was seeing green, red spots, and dots covered my eyes, and I was locked in severe tunnel vision, spinning, and feeling my spirit speeding through that tunnel. And the next second I was slammed back into my body. I swear I felt I was being ripped apart. There was a sensation of my esophagus swelling up. I grabbed at my throat. I could barely breathe. I was convinced those vines were sprouting. And I felt myself becoming green, sprouting. I swore my skin was tearing, shredding. Tunnel vision. I was pulled back into the tunnel. Then, all was dark. I woke up in a hospital and I was amazed. When I looked down, I wasn't green. I wasn't shredded all over, but I discovered I no longer had a full right leg. They had completed the amputation. I found I had lost too much blood, almost died, and suffered complications. The recovery process wasn't quick, but I was alive, and in a relatively normal state. For that, I was thankful. We never found out what happened at that house. The news never reported on it, and nobody we asked seemed to know. Neighbors reported seeing crews working on the house after the night I was hospitalized. It was cleared out and put up for sale. Did you ever call anyone when you smelled that awful smell? I asked them. Some had made calls, others didn't. One admitted to opening the front door and looking inside, but she was too afraid to wander deeper. She said police came to the residence. She saw their vehicles outside and assumed the situation had been dealt with. 2 days before my incident, I never explained to the neighbors exactly what I saw, but I later recounted the events to my friend. She believes I had a psychotic episode after discovering dead bodies in the home. I didn't see a dead body. And if she doesn't believe me, maybe someone on the internet will. Maybe someone out there has an explanation. Does anyone understand what the hell was going on there? Have you ever heard of the ship of Theseus? It's a thought experiment that proposes this question. Is an object with all its parts replaced still fundamentally the same object? This is the paradox that has been plaguing my mind ever since I made it back home. Ever since I saw my beautiful wife and daughter once again. Or at least, what I assumed to be once again. When I first opened my eyes, the world surrounding me was so dark that I had thought for a moment I'd gone blind. Looking around, I could see the faintest hints of my grayed out figure. I attempted to move my arms, but quickly discovered they were bound. Thin strands of what seemed to be fishing wire held my wrists to the armrest. Panic quickly set in, and I began thrashing my body around, only stopping when I felt the wires around my ankles and wrists tightening from the struggle. Attempting to calm my breathing, I scanned the area around me, hoping my eyes would adjust to the darkness and reveal something to me. Every inhale, I could feel stale air and dust particle coating my tongue. The dry air pluming into my chest started making it hard to breathe. I was still groggy, and when I tried to call out for someone's attention, I could feel the groaning in my voice, like two bricks rubbing against each other. From across the room, I heard similar noises to the ones I was making. The sounds of wire scraping against wood, the helplessness of a body fighting against its firm captor. You'll make it worse if you move. I spoke into the voice, my voice struggling past the grains of debris in my throat. What's going on? Who are you? A man's voice replied, but it was like my voice had an echo when he spoke, an echo that warped into new words upon hitting the walls. I was taken aback when I heard him speak. Maybe my voice was too gravelly for him to hear it, but he sounded just like me. I'm Carlos. I'm assuming you're stuck. I am too. My reply was more for me than a direct response to him. I wanted the man across the room to know I wasn't a threat, that whatever we were in, it was together. My fingers trembled around the end of the armrest, looking for a way I could slip the wires over a weak point in the wood. That's when the very tips of my fingers fell on a small and cold plastic circle, just within reach under the armrest. I inspected it as much as I could, and when I put pressure on it, I could feel it sliding in farther. It was a button. Do you have a button? I asked. Under your right armrest? I farthered the instruction. I heard the wires around his wrist scraping the wood for a moment before the man replied, stating there wasn't one. My confusion over the differences in our chairs melted away when the room became flooded with intense yellow light. With the lights buzzing around us, I and the man finally got a good look at each other, both of our jaws hanging open in awe. What the hell is this? The man across from me spoke. His voice had lowered substantially. He wasn't asking me. It was more like he was mulling it over. I could only stare, scrutinize each piece of the man before my eyes looked for some imperfection, something to differentiate the two of us, from the dark brown hair to the white sneakers with green stains from the lawn on them. We were the spitting image of each other. I was looking at myself. Even the way my nose bent slightly to the left, from when Andrew Mackey found me flirting with his girlfriend in high school. Every time he talked or moved, I would observe the wrinkles around his mouth or how the fabric altered around him. Every single thing was the damn same. Then it dawned on me. The lights didn't just happen to come on. Someone must have been around to turn them on. Once again, I looked around the room, observing as much as I could with my limited range of movement. The room was sterile, like a cleared-out hospital room. It was much smaller than I expected. It felt like my voice traveled forever before hitting a wall, but the room was no bigger than some apartment living room. "Can you see anything behind me?" I asked the man, trying to keep a calm composure, but still running over the possibilities in my head. A twin brother, maybe? That wouldn't explain the matching scars I've acquired over the years. "No, just more of the same walls," he said. I could sense in his voice that he too was bringing his anxiety to a more manageable level. Of course, he was acting like me too. "What's the last thing you remember?" I questioned. Maybe I could find an explanation if I knew how we both got here. The last thing I remembered was exiting work. It was a long day, and I was running late so the sun was setting. Then the van pulled up. "A van," the man spoke, the matter-of-fact way. "Where do you work?" "Ellington," he responded. He didn't even have to stop and think about it. He was already in his thoughts. Because I made him think of the van, which made him think about leaving work. Me too. The whole picture wasn't something I wanted to see, but I was putting the pieces together nonetheless. Which meant the man sitting in front of me was doing the same. We knew what we were looking at before we heard the crackle chime in around us.
"Not if you can hear me."
A voice with a difficult to pin down accent spoke. His voice seemed to emit from each corner of the room. I watched the man across from me nodding his head, up and down slowly, and I followed suit.
"Fantastic. For sake of simplicity, I'm going to make nicknames for you two,"
he continued.
"The Carlos with the button under his armrest will be called Mr. B, for button. The man without one will be called Mr. A, not if you understand."
Once again, me and Mr. A nodded our heads in unison. We knew we were in no position to be making demands. Neither of us had seen so much as a door leading out of the room.
"Allow me to explain your predicament,"
the accented voice of God began.
"One of you is the original Carlos Ackers. The other one is a clone."
As we listened to the man speak, me and Mr. A locked eyes, like we were trying to see if a soul existed in the other person.
"It's up to Mr. B to make the decision."
Mr. A's face contorted. When I watched him scrunch up, I wanted to say he looked different. I wanted to say he was clearly a fake, but even in distress, his face was mine.
"Pushing that button, Mr. B, will kill Mr. A."
My fingers had been subconsciously meandering around the button since I first woke up. The cool plastic was calming me. It quickly became a source of concern. "How do we know which one's the original?" Mr. A spoke aloud. He said it just as I was moving my lips to say the same thing. Each of us was thinking the same thought, though. Did it matter who was the original?
"Ah, yes. Great question. The clone is rather perfect.
God whispered through the loudspeakers.
Memories, emotions, and physical attributes, all the same."
It was like a game of Russian roulette. Both of us intensely eyeing each other, for just something, anything to set us apart.
"The only difference being, the original got to live that life you both remember. You have 30 minutes to decide. If Mr. B doesn't push the button, he dies."
After that, we heard the fuzzing interrupted by a sharp click. We were alone again. The voice had said everything it wanted to say. We were an experiment, and now all that was left? Observations and results. It's hard to describe, but it felt like there was an argument going on between ourselves that only took place in our minds. We became increasingly aware of how futile it would be to make a case to the other. Everything I could say, he could confirm. The names of my wife and daughter, my crush in middle school, and my biggest fears. He could echo them back through crystal clarity. All we had to go off was the room around us. "Let's agree on some," Mr. A asserted. I broke the trance I had fallen into and asked him to continue. The original should go free. There was no way to argue that logic. Of course the original should continue to live. The clone was just a product. It never actually experienced the life the memories would portray. So how do we figure that out? I responded. There was no doubt in my mind we were both convinced we were the original. How could I be a clone? How could he be a clone? Why do you have the button? Would he give the original the button? His proposal was sound. Would the clone have the button to kill its template? It seemed reasonable. The test would be weighted towards the original surviving, unless they were seeing how human they could make the clone. If it could make hard decisions like this. No, that doesn't help, I responded. But I could see in his face that he had already come to the same conclusion I had. Then we talked. We both knew it was useless, but we talked. And it was oddly therapeutic, having everything laid out before my eyes, exactly how I felt and thought about the events in my life, through someone else's lips. Put a lot into perspective for me. The conversation made me feel that I had to be the original. There was no way I could feel the things I was feeling if I was a product, right? More and more my finger drifted toward the plastic button. If I just pressed it, without warning. Either way, I'd be the one to live. Clone or not, I would be alive. Neither of us knew how much time had passed. It was impossible to tell, but as it went on, I started to worry that Mr. A was stalling me. If enough time passed, it was reasonable to believe he would live by default. He could see it. He was trying to hide it, but I would never be able to do so neither. Could he? His eyes nervously twitching to gaze at the button, watching my fingers moving about. What if none of this is even real? Just a test? What if it doesn't matter? He spoke. His voice was becoming grainy as he breathed in the stale air. All the power was in my hands, and he knew that he had to create doubt in my head. That's what I would do. How long has it been? I questioned. Probably around 20 minutes, he replied. I wanted him to say that it only had been a few minutes, then I could call bullshit. I just wanted anything to come along and justify hitting that button, so I could stop thinking about it. If I was the clone, walking around living this man's life, relishing in the things I didn't earn nor deserve. If I killed this man, and he was the original, what kind of monster would I be? It's okay either way, right? He spoke with a smile. Even if the clone leaves here, they'll be taken care of. With those words pressing into my chest, I thought of them again, and couldn't help but reflect his smile. I had decided, genuinely was ready to let time run out at that moment, that we neither of us had to choose. That's when he did it. Still wearing that smile, he suddenly threw his body forward, and gave a quick scream like he was some cheap jump scare. His actions snapped me out of my thoughts so harsh, that it made me reactively move backward and clutch the armrest. Before I could stop myself, I felt the cool plastic under my fingertips, being pressed in until a soft buzz was created. No, I pleaded as the buzzing halted. Hanging in the dispense, I watched Mr. A, looking around the room before returning his gaze to me with a smile. The breath we had been holding in since the button press was released. See? Just a test. No hit. Mr. A's body began rocking back and forth, a small prelude to the violent shaking that followed it. I could see the wires around his wrist glowing red hot, and he convulsed in the chair, still confined by the wires. All I could do was watch as he thrashed around, the wood of the chair bending nearly to the point of shattering in half. My words would fall on deaf ears, and my actions wouldn't be seen by boiling eyes. It felt like I was dying, like I was watching from outside my own body, as I was fried to death. I felt a phantom pain burn in my chest as my emotions escaped and formed into streams running down my cheek. And then, Mr. A was still, slumped over and smoking in the chair. I would have sat forever if I didn't see a small line of black forming in the corner. A door was opening, and the arms of the chair holding my arms were dropped. This allowed me enough wiggle room to slip my arms back and free them from the wires. Reaching down to tug at the wires around my ankles, I did my best not to inhale the scent of the burning body across from me, or think of the implications. The rest of my time spent in that building might as well have been some kind of fever dream. There was nothing but silence as I rose from my chair and left the room. A long dark hallway with a singular light at the end of it. I found myself surrounded by trees and thick foliage upon exiting the tunnel, leaving the small metal hatch behind me. Eventually, I found the outskirts of the forest where my car was waiting for me and drove home. My thoughts and feelings were left in that room. Part of me only interprets the events as a dream. When I saw my wife and child again, it was like I had never left. They welcomed me with open arms. Why wouldn't they? I'm me, right? I love them all the same. I laugh with them. I work hard. I'm a good guy. The same good guy I've always been. That I remember always being. So why is it? Whenever I catch sight of the small scar hiding in between my pointer and middle finger, I can't remember if I've always had it or not. I bought a project house in Detroit last year. This is a pretty common thing to do. Detroit has been coming back since the recession. And I wanted a piece of cheap real estate before what happened in Corktown happens in my neighborhood and drives up the prices. Having a project house was new for me, but as someone who has worked in construction for all my life, I know most of what to do. And if I don't know it, I know where to get a guy who does. It was a good time. That first summer, I'd have get-togethers with my friends at the house after work. We'd all sit in the backyard and drink. Sometimes my buddies would help do repairs, and I'd take them out for dinner downtown. During the summer, I focused on structural renovations that could not be done in cold weather. I had a lot of work to do outside, as the backyard was a complete mess, but I figured it would be best to do that during the fall, after all of the vines and weeds have died. When fall came, I took to cleaning out the backyard one weekend. The whole thing was covered in vines, which had luckily shriveled and died with the end of summer. I used trimmers and pitchforks to get rid of them, and piled all the dead plants along with a bunch of trash in the bed of my pickup truck. Upon clearing out some of the vines, I noticed that I once had a fenced-in backyard. Most of the rusted chain-link fence had been cut through, rusted out, or collapsed to the ground, and gotten buried by plant growth. What caught my attention was the gate that the face was linked to. The gate did not match the chain-link fence whatsoever. It was about chin height, and made of plain, solid iron. It was incredibly rusty, and stained my gloves bright orange when I ran my hand along the side. 6 vertical iron bars, and 2 cross links made up the door portion, and it was positioned between 2 more vertical iron poles that connected to the fallen chain link fence. A few flimsy hinges held a heavy door to its post, and there was a mounted plate with a slot where one could put a lock. A loop was welded to the other post for the locking mechanism. The gate was held shut with a long, rusty bolt through the loop. I immediately found it unsightly, and went up to the gate to see if I could move its posts. Despite how flimsy it looked, the posts seemed to be set in concrete, and getting them out was probably going to be a pain in the ass. I absentmindedly pulled out the bolt, and pulled the gate toward me. A hideous, horror movie creak emitted from the hinges, and I was immediately hit with the smell of burning electrical wiring. A very specific smell, I know, but as a construction foreman, and a longtime Detroit resident, I know the smell. Back when Detroit had a huge arson problem, it was the scent that lingered in the air after the fires. As unpleasant as it is, I brushed it off at that moment. The few remaining houses on my block were pretty decrepit, and it did not seem unusual for an electrical issue to be happening nearby. I went back inside to check my house just in case, and I found nothing wrong. Later that evening, I was packing up my tools and getting ready to head back to my home in Royal Oak. I went out back to grab my pitchfork, and I noticed something odd. There was a small, white triangle in my backyard, lying next to the gate. The daylight was fading fast, and the white shape stood out glaringly obvious in the mowed weeds of my backyard. I went over to check it out, and was bewildered with what I found. It was a pile of gray ash. Now, ash in Detroit was also not an unusual occurrence at one point, but those days are long gone. I was looking at a pile of fine, gray ash. It was spread across the grass in a funnel-like shape, with the tip of the funnel beginning at the gate, which I had left very slightly ajar. I touched the ash and ran it through my fingers. The larger flakes disintegrated into white dust and drifted into the air, releasing the light scent of burnt wood. I peered into the empty lot which was beyond the gate. Nothing but an empty lot. Certainly no large campfire or burning pile of garbage. I scanned the rest of my lawn. No ash, except the triangle emitting from the gate. At this point, I was slightly freaked out. I headed home and tried to push the thought from my mind. It wasn't really the pile of ash that unnerved me. It was the thought of how it got there. Sure, it was weird and didn't belong in my yard, but it was just ash. Someone put it there, likely when I was inside the house. This involved a stranger on my property, but who would bother with leaving a pile of ash in a stranger's yard in a blighted neighborhood? I deducted that wind must have brought it in, but I still couldn't shake the feeling in my gut I had gotten from seeing that triangle of ash. I returned to work the next day, and had pushed the thought of the gates and its ash from my mind. Midweek, I stopped to my project house to do a quick once-over, and make sure all was well. When walking through the backyard, I noticed the pile of ash was gone. There had been some storms and wind during the week, so I found its disappearance to be somewhat comforting. But I quickly noticed something a bit more concerning. The gate was wired shut. Someone had wrapped cheap gardening wire several times around the gate and the iron poles it rested between. Someone had definitely been in my yard while I wasn't around. If someone was messing with the gate, what else did they get into? I kept my phone in my hand and very carefully checked over the house. Everything was just as I left it, nothing broken or missing. I toyed with the idea of installing an alarm system in my house, though I currently had nothing of value inside, not even furniture. The house was still in the major renovation process. There wasn't much that could be hurt inside my house, unless they were arsonists, and wished they would just set my porch and the exterior of my house on fire. I thought about it for a bit, and decided that a motion sensing surveillance camera would be a good move, so I could see still shots of the trespasser, rather than have to sift through hours of video, or purchase and wire up an alarm system. The following day, I bought the camera and a mount, and installed it on one of the windowsills facing the backyard. That weekend, I felt a bit too burned out to make progress on my house, and decided that I would just go collect the SIM card, and check the camera before planning any large repairs. I was half expecting to see a bunch of people fooling around in my yard, and figured I'd need the upcoming time to think about installing a better fence. All of the dead foliage, rusty fence, and trash that I cleaned from my backyard probably acted as a natural barrier that kept most trespassers out. I loaded the images. Rows and rows of identical looking pictures of that rusty old gate popped up. I scrolled past them. These cameras are super sensitive to any movement. Even a wind that rustled the leaves in the abandoned lot behind the gate could have set off the camera. Immediately, a picture caught my eye. There was a person in this photo. A dark figure in the right-hand side of the frame looked to be walking through my yard toward the gate. I could only see the person's back. It looked as if they were coming from my front yard, which faces the street. Several more frames showed the figure approaching the gate. More shots showed the person turning around and exiting my yard through the right side of the photo, back the way they came. I checked the timestamps on the photos. This person walked into my yard just after 2 in the morning and was gone within 2 minutes. It almost looked as though the stranger had come into my yard to check on something and get out. They looked to be only looking at the gate in every single photo. Perhaps this was the person who had wired the gate shut. Why the hell would someone care that much about a gate in the backyard of an until recently abandoned house? I looked up from my laptop through my truck's windshield. The gate in the backyard looked dull and rusty in the autumn sun. Something about it seemed insidious to me now, and I just wanted the thing out of my backyard. I closed my laptop and put the SIM card back in the camera on the window. I grabbed the wire cutters and my shovel from the back of my truck, and decided that I'd spend this afternoon attempting to get rid of it. I approached the gate from the empty lot that lay beyond my backyard, and cut through the layers of gardening wire. The gate sagged on its hinges more and more with each layer of wire I cut through. I finished snipping the wire and crossed over to my front yard to begin digging out the poles. I dug down into the soft earth in my backyard, my shovel scraping pebbles and bits of broken glass on the way in. When my shovel had reached nearly a foot into the dirt, I was sure I had cleared the depths of the concrete base, but continued to hear scraping when I turned my blade into the pole. Frustrated, I decided to tackle the pole from another angle. I pushed open the gate and stepped through. Immediately, the acrid smell of burning chemicals hit my nose and I gagged. My eyes burned. My shovel thudded to the ground as I involuntarily began rubbing my eyes. When I opened my eyes, my breath lodged in my throat. The sky was dark and filled with bluish smoke. The lot I was standing in was no longer empty. I was in the backyard of a once beautiful turn-of-the-century house. Heat radiated off my face as orange flames licked up and down the wooden siding and poured from every window. I looked around. I was in my neighborhood, but every empty lot had a house in it, and every single house was on fire. I heard nothing but the roaring of flames consuming thousands of houses. I looked southeast, scanning the horizon for the tip of the Renaissance Center. It was not there. A hot wind whirled around me, carrying fine, white ash. I wheezed as smoke began to fill my lungs, and I turned around. On the ground lay the gate, which had fallen off its hinges. This story is extrapolated from a missing persons case in the city of Detroit. Surveillance camera footage contains the last known images of the subject, in which he disappears after stepping through a gate between his backyard and an empty lot. All that could be uncovered at the scene was his pickup truck and traces of ash on the ground.